The Bitterroot Mountains of Montana do not forgive. They do not care about fairness or justice or the ancient bloodlines of wolves. They only care about who can endure the cold. The wind howled through the towering lodgepole pines, a brutal physical force that stripped the warmth from anything it touched. It was a winter that felt less like a season and more like a punishment. Beneath the shadow of a massive granite overhang, a young woman knelt in the snow. Her name was Alara. She was 21 years old, though the calluses on her hands and the quiet guarded look in her eyes belonged to someone who had lived 3 lifetimes of hard labor. She was an omega. In the eyes of the pack, that meant she was the dirt beneath their boots. She was the one who gathered the firewood when the blizzards raged, the one who scoured the frozen earth for roots, the one who ate what was left only after the lowest-ranking enforcers had finished. But the years of forced servitude had not broken her. They had honed her. While the alphas and betas relied on their raw strength and the warmth of the pack lodge, Alara had learned the deep, silent language of the wilderness. Her bare fingers were stained dark with pine pitch and dried blood, but they moved with absolute precision. On the frozen ground before her lay a wolf pup, barely 3 months old, shivering violently. Its hind leg was caught in a rusted snare, the metal biting deep into the bone. "Steady," Alara whispered. Her voice was a low, rhythmic murmur, designed to soothe the frantic animal. I know the pain. Just let me work." From a small woven pouch at her hip, she pulled a handful of dried yarrow and a thick paste made of crushed willow bark. She didn't have the luxury of modern medicine or the pack's healer. She had what the earth gave her. With steady, unyielding hands, she wedged a piece of heavy timber into the snare's mechanism, bearing down with her meager body weight until the iron jaws groaned and snapped open. The pup whined, a high, reedy sound of agony. Alara immediately packed the bleeding wound with the yarrow, binding it tight with strips torn from the hem of her own ragged wool coat. She didn't feel the biting wind against her exposed legs. She only focused on the pulse of the small creature beneath her hands. "There," she breathed, smoothing the pup's coarse fur. "You'll walk again. Just stay off the—" A massive hand closed around the back of Alara's neck. The force of the grip lifted her entirely off her feet. She didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only excited them. She was thrown backward, her body slamming hard into the trunk of a frozen pine. The breath exploded from her lungs in a white cloud. Before her stood Thorn. He was the alpha of the Bitterroot pack, a man built like a mountain of muscle and cruelty. He wore a heavy cloak of silver wolf pelt, a stark contrast to Alara's threadbare clothes. His eyes, the color of dirty ice, looked down at her with a disgust that was absolute. "You waste pack resources on the weak Omega," Thorn spat. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the cold air. He didn't look at the pup, which was now limping frantically into the brush. He looked only at Alara, seeing nothing but a stain on his territory. "It was dying," Alara said. She kept her gaze fixed on the snow at Thorn's boots. Eye contact was a challenge, and a challenge meant death. A pack is only as strong as its foundation. Thorn let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. It held no humor. "A pack is as strong as its alpha, and you, Alara, are a reminder of a weakness I will no longer tolerate. Get back to the compound. Tonight is the gathering, and it will be your last." He turned and walked away, his heavy boots crunching through the crust of the snow. Alara stayed on the ground for a long time, letting the freezing air numb the throbbing pain in her spine. She knew what tonight meant. When the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, the darkness did not bring quiet. It brought the drums. The gathering circle was a wide clearing surrounded by ancient, towering pines. In the center, a bonfire roared, the flames leaping 20 feet into the black sky, feeding on massive logs of resin-soaked cedar. The heat was intense, but it did not reach the edges of the circle where Alara stood. She stood alone. The rest of the pack, over 100 wolves in their human forms, clustered in tight, warm groups closer to the fire. They wore thick furs and drank hot spiced cider, their laughter sharp and jagged in the night air. Alara wore the same torn coat, the cold seeping into her marrow. Tonight was the claiming, a night where status was cemented, where alliances were forged, and where the useless were discarded. The drum stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow. Thorn stepped onto the elevated stone platform before the fire. The orange light cast deep, demonic shadows across his face. He did not ask for their attention. His sheer presence commanded it. He looked over his people, a king surveying a kingdom he ruled not by respect, but by terror. Then his eyes found the shadows at the back. They locked onto Alara. "Bring her forward," Thorn commanded. 2 of his enforcers, massive men with scarred faces, stepped out of the crowd. They didn't escort Alara, they dragged her. They hauled her by her arms through the parted crowd, throwing her roughly onto the hard frozen earth at the base of the stone platform. The snow beneath her hands was wet with melted ice. She pushed herself up to her knees, her auburn hair falling across her face. She refused to tremble. If this was the end, she would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. Thorn looked down at her. He paced the edge of the stone, ensuring every member of the pack could hear his judgment. "Look at her!" Thorn's voice boomed, carrying easily over the crackle of the fire. "Look at the remnants of a traitor's bloodline." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alara's jaw tightened. Her mother. 10 years ago, Thorn continued, his voice dripping with righteous anger. Her mother, the former herbalist, betrayed this pack. She tried to sell our borders to the southern factions. She was executed for her crimes. And out of mercy, my mercy, I allowed the child to live. I allowed her to eat our food, to sleep on our land. But she is broken. She is an omega who produces nothing, who contributes nothing, who carries the taint of a traitor in her veins. It was a lie, a calculated political lie that Alara had been forced to swallow every day of her life. Her mother had never been a traitor. Her mother had been the keeper of the geothermal maps. In the Bitterroot Mountains, the winter could last for 8 months. The only way the pack survived was by knowing the secret locations of the deep underground hot springs, places where the earth's heat kept the game plentiful and the ground unfrozen. Thorn hadn't killed her mother for treason. He had killed her to take the maps. He had murdered her to centralize the power, ensuring that no one in the pack could survive the winter without bowing to his absolute authority. He hoarded the resources, starving out the weaker families to maintain a desperate, unquestioning loyalty. Alara knew the truth, because her mother in her dying breaths had not given Thorn the maps. She had whispered the coordinates into Alara's ear. Alara was the map. "I reject this Omega," Thorn declared, the words striking like physical blows. "She is no longer of the Bitterroot. She is nameless. She is packless." The crowd jeered. Someone threw a half-empty wooden mug. It struck Alara's shoulder, splashing her with cold cider. Thorn stepped down from the stone. He stopped right in front of her. He drew a long, serrated hunting knife from his belt. The steel glinted in the firelight. "You do not get to leave with our scent on you," he whispered low enough that only she could hear. Before Alara could brace herself, Thorn's hand lashed out. The blade sliced clean across the side of her ribs, slicing through her coat, her shirt, and deep into her flesh. The pain was a blinding flash of white-hot fire. Alara gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her side. Warm, thick blood instantly soaked her fingers. "Throw her out," Thorn commanded, turning his back on her. "Let the mountain have her." The enforcers grabbed her again. They dragged her away from the heat, away from the light, out past the tree line, and to the very edge of the territory border. The wind here was a physical wall. "Keep running, trash," one of the enforcers sneered. "If the cold doesn't stop your heart, the grizzlies will." They shoved her hard. Alara stumbled and fell face first into a deep snowdrift. She heard their heavy boots crunching away, heading back to the warmth of the fire. She lay there for a long moment. The snow against her cheek felt almost peaceful. The bleeding in her side was steady, the heat of her own life draining into the frozen earth. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. The cold was a heavy blanket, whispering promises of sleep. But as the edges of her vision began to darken, an image flashed in her mind. Her mother's face, bruised and bleeding, whispering the coordinates of the springs. "You are the keeper now, Alara. Do not let the fire die." Alara's eyes snapped open. The despair vanished, replaced by a cold, hard ember of fury. She would not die here. She would not let Thorn's lie be the final truth of her bloodline. She pushed herself up. The pain in her ribs screamed, a sharp tearing sensation that made her vision swim. She clamped her hand hard over the wound, applying brutal pressure to stem the bleeding. She forced herself to stand. The blizzard was blinding. Visibility was less than 10 feet. To walk aimlessly was a death sentence. But Alara did not walk aimlessly. For 10 years, she had been sent out into these storms to gather wood. For 10 years, she had been forbidden from using the main trails. She knew the wilderness not as a conqueror, but as an intimate friend. She knew how the wind shifted when it hit the granite faces. She knew the smell of the different pines. She lifted her face to the biting wind. She didn't look with her eyes, she breathed. Pine, ash, ice. And their faint, almost imperceptible, beneath the smell of her own blood sulfur. It was miles away, but she locked onto it. The ancient lava tubes. A network of underground caves heated by the deep tectonic vents of the mountains. It was an area Thorn's men avoided, fearing the unstable ground and the toxic gases. But Alara knew exactly which vents breathed clean air. She began to walk. It was a march of sheer stubborn agony. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The snow was thigh-deep in places, forcing her to drag her legs through the resistance. Her breath rattled in her chest, freezing into ice crystals on her eyelashes. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Time lost its meaning in the white void. The only reality was the mechanical process of placing one foot in front of the other. The blood from her side had slowed freezing against her skin, binding her torn clothes to the wound. She used the natural terrain to guide her, feeling the dip of a ravine, the sudden incline of a ridge. When her legs finally gave out, she dragged herself by her elbows, her fingers hooking into the roots of dead trees. Eventually, the texture of the snow changed. It became heavier, wetter. The air temperature rose by a fraction of a degree. The smell of sulfur grew stronger. Alara crested a small rise and saw it, a jagged black fissure in the side of a snow-covered hill, a volcanic vent. Steam curled lazily from the dark opening, melting the snow around its edges. She threw herself toward it, sliding down the embankment and crawling into the mouth of the cave. The contrast was immediate. The wind ceased. The air inside the cavern was heavy, damp, and smelled of wet earth and ancient minerals. The ambient temperature was easily 50 degrees warmer than the blizzard outside. Ilara collapsed onto the hard stone floor, her chest heaving. She had made it. She had survived Thorn's death sentence. She lay in the dark for several minutes, simply breathing, letting the warmth thaw the ice from her hair. But as her senses slowly returned, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She wasn't alone. The air in the cave didn't just smell of sulfur. It smelled of copper, of fresh blood, and something else, a scent that made her omega instincts flare with a mixture of terror and awe. It was the scent of an alpha, but not Thorn's bitter, oppressive stench. This was the scent of ozone, of deep winter forests, of quiet, unquestionable power. But it was tainted. It smelled sick. Alara pushed herself up onto her knees, ignoring the protesting scream of her ribs. She moved deeper into the cavern, her hands feeling along the damp rock wall. 20 yards in, the cave opened up into a wider chamber, faintly illuminated by a fissure in the ceiling that let in the pale moonlight. In the center of the chamber lay a man. He was massive, his frame easily dwarfing Thorn's. He wore heavy tactical survival gear, dark canvas reinforced leather, and a thick cloak of black wolf fur. But he was not standing. He was crumpled against a stalagmite, his breathing shallow and erratic. Alara hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to run. An injured predator was the most dangerous kind. But her practical eyes caught the details. There was a dark spreading stain on his shoulder, a deep laceration. But that wasn't what was killing him. Black veins spider-webbed outward from the wound, climbing up his neck and disappearing beneath his jawline. His skin was pale, drenched in a sickly sweat. Wolfsbane, and not just the natural plant. This was weaponized, a concentrated extract likely laced with silver filings. It was a coward's poison used by assassins who lacked the courage to look a man in the eye. Alara knew who this man was. Everyone in the Bitterroot knew the stories. This was Kaelen, the AlphaKing of the Northern Territories. A man known for his strategic brilliance, his absolute authority, and his unyielding sense of honor. He was the only alpha in the region who openly opposed Thorn's tyrannical grip on the borderlands. And Thorn's men had finally gotten to him. Kaelen's eyes suddenly snapped open. They were a piercing, vivid gold, glowing faintly in the dim light. Even dying, his gaze held an intensity that pinned Alara to the spot. His hand, trembling violently, reached for a heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He moved with agonizing slowness, but the intent was clear. He thought she was one of them, the assassins sent to finish the job. "Stop," Alara said. Her voice was steady, cutting through the damp air. "If you pull that blade, your heart rate will spike. The poison will hit your brain in under a minute. You will die." Kaelen's hand froze on the hilt of the knife. He studied her. He saw the torn, blood-soaked clothes. He saw her small stature. And he saw the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. "You," Kaelen rasped, his voice a deep, gravelly ruin. "You are Bitterroot." "I was," Alara corrected, stepping closer into the moonlight. "Now I am nothing. But I am also the only thing standing between you and the grave." She didn't wait for his permission. She dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, the damage was severe. The wound on his shoulder was ragged, likely a crossbow bolt that he had pulled out himself. "Thorn's work," Kaelen breathed, his eyes tracking her every movement. "Thorn doesn't have the stomach for a fair fight," Alara agreed. She opened her woven pouch. The supplies she had used on the pup were gone, but she still had her emergency reserves. The things she had scavenged from the deepest, most dangerous parts of the forest. "This is gonna hurt," Alara stated flatly. She didn't offer comfort. Comfort wouldn't save him. Competence would. Do it. Kaelen growled, his jaw locking tight. Alara pulled a handful of activated charcoal burned from specific willow branches she kept dry in her pockets. She mixed it with a handful of clean snow from the cave entrance, mashing it into a thick, gritty paste. The silver in the wound is acting as an anchor for the wolfsbane, she explained, her hands moving with practiced, clinical speed. I have to draw the poison to the surface. It will feel like fire. She pressed the charcoal paste directly into the open wound. Kaelin's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural snarl ripped from his throat, the sound bouncing off the cavern walls. His massive hands shot out and gripped Alara's wrist. The strength in his fingers was terrifying. He could have snapped her bones like dry twigs. Alara didn't flinch. She looked directly into his glowing golden eyes. Hold on, she commanded. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. An Omega giving an order to an AlphaKing. For a second, surprise flickered in Kaelin's eyes. Then slowly his grip loosened. He didn't let go of her wrist, but he stopped crushing it. He grounded himself, using her physical presence, riding out the waves of agonizing pain. As the charcoal began to bind to the toxins, Alara reached for her final, most precious supply. From a small leather vial, she tapped out a pinch of dried black powder. The blackroot, a rare tuber that grew only near the sulfur vents. It was highly toxic in large doses, but in micro amounts, it could restart a failing heart. Open your mouth, she told him. Kaelen looked at the black powder. He looked at her. He was a king who trusted no one, surrounded by betrayals and assassins. To consume an unknown substance from a stranger was tactical suicide. If I wanted you dead, Alara said quietly, reading his hesitation, I would have stayed outside and let the cold do my work. Open. Kaelen held her gaze for a long moment. He saw no deception, only a fierce, stubborn determination. He opened his mouth. Alara placed the powder on his tongue. Swallow, do not chew. He swallowed. The reaction was almost immediate. Kaelen gasped, his back arching off the stone floor as the black root shocked his nervous system. His breathing, previously shallow and ragged, deepened into harsh, greedy pulls of air. The black veins creeping up his neck stopped their advance, then slowly, agonizingly began to recede as the charcoal drew the poison out and his own immense alpha healing factor kicked in. The crisis had passed, but the toll was heavy. Kaelin's head lolled back against the rock, his eyes fluttering shut. He was out. Alara didn't stop moving. She stripped off her own blood-stained coat and laid it over his chest. She gathered dry moss and lichen from the cavern walls, using a piece of flint and the steel of her knife to strike a spark. Soon a small, smokeless fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow over the stone. Only when the fire was steady did Alara finally allow herself to rest. She slumped against the cave wall directly across from the sleeping AlphaKing. Her own side throbbed viciously, but the bleeding had stopped. She watched his chest rise and fall. She had just saved the life of Thorn's greatest enemy. She had just altered the balance of power in the Bitterroot Mountains. But she felt no triumph. She only felt the bone-deep exhaustion of survival. As the hours passed, the blizzard outside raged on, burying her footprints, erasing all evidence that the Omega named Alara had ever existed. Morning came not with light, but with a subtle shift in the air pressure of the cave. Alara was already awake. She was feeding small twigs into the fire. Across the cavern, Kaelen stirred. He didn't thrash or groan. He woke like a soldier, instantly alert, his eyes snapping open to assess his surroundings. He felt the bandage on his shoulder. He felt the absence of the poison burning in his blood. He sat up slowly, testing his strength. He was weak, but he was alive. He looked across the fire at Alara. She didn't look away. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her knees, waiting. Kaelin's golden eyes studied her with a new intensity. He took in her youth, the vicious slice across her ribs, the quiet, unyielding dignity in her posture. He recognized the strength it took to survive a winter night in the Bitterroot with a bleeding wound. He recognized the profound skill it took to treat weaponized wolfsbane in the dark. He did not see an outcast. He saw a warrior. Kaelen leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The air between them was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was charged with a mutual, unspoken respect. You know the terrain well enough to find this place in a whiteout, Kaelen said, his voice still rough but steady. You know the herbs well enough to cheat death, and you know Thorn well enough to know he needs to be stopped. Alara remained silent, letting him speak. Kaelen met her gaze, his expression entirely serious. I owe you my life, a debt I do not take lightly, but I am not offering you a reward. I am offering you a position. Alara's brow furrowed slightly. A position. I have the numbers. I have the strength, Kaelen said softly, the authority of a king radiating from him. But my men are blind in these mountains. Thorn controls the routes. He controls the high ground. I need someone who knows the shadows. I need someone who can draw the map to his throat. He didn't ask her to follow him. He didn't command her to serve. He asked for her expertise. You want me to guide your army, Alara stated. I want you, Kaelen corrected, to be my strategic advisor, equal in voice when it comes to the terrain. You lead the way, and I will be the sword that clears the path. Alara looked into the fire. For her entire life, she had been told she was worthless. She had been beaten, starved, and thrown away to die. Now the most powerful alpha in the north was looking at her not as prey, not as a prize, but as a partner. She thought of Thorn. She thought of the lie that had killed her mother. She thought of the maps locked inside her head. Alara lifted her chin. The outcast was gone. In her place sat the architect of Thorn's destruction. When do we start? Alara asked. The storm broke on the third day. The howling wind that had battered the volcanic cave finally died down, leaving behind a silence so profound it made the ears ring. Alara stood at the mouth of the cavern. The Bitterroot Mountains stretched out before her, a jagged ocean of pristine white and deep shadow-drenched greens. The air was so cold it burned the lungs, but the sky was a piercing cloudless blue. Behind her, the heavy scrape of boots on stone echoed. Kaelen emerged from the gloom. He moved stiffly. The wolfsbane was gone from his blood, neutralized by the charcoal and the black root, but the physical trauma of the crossbow wound remained. Yet his posture was unbowed. He stood like a man who owned the horizon. We move, Kaelen said. His voice was a low rumble, stripped of the gravelly weakness of the night before. Thorn's hunters will be tracking the blood trail. We need to reach the northern ridge before nightfall. Alara didn't argue. She tightened the bindings around her ribs. The cut Thorn had given her was a steady, dull ache, but it was closed. The main passes are buried, she said, her eyes scanning the topography. And Thorn's men will watch the tree lines. We take the high gullies. The snow is deeper, but the granite walls block the scent. Kaelen looked at her. He didn't question her judgment. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply nodded. Lead the way. The trek was brutal. It was a test of endurance that stripped away everything but the mechanical necessity of survival. Alara broke the trail. She read the snowpack like a printed page, avoiding the hidden crevasses and the soft drifts that could swallow a person whole. Kaelen followed exactly in her footsteps. For a man used to leading, used to being the vanguard, submitting to the pace of an Omega was unheard of in their world. But Kaelen was not a common alpha. He recognized competence. He respected the land, and he respected the woman who knew how to navigate it. By mid-afternoon, the shadows began to lengthen, turning the snow a deep bruised purple. A sudden sharp whistle cut through the freezing air. Alara froze her hand, dropping instantly to the hunting knife she had scavenged from the cave. Kaelen stepped smoothly around her, his massive frame shielding her from the ridge above. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply raised his right hand a closed fist. From the snow-draped branches of a massive spruce, 3 figures dropped. They landed with terrifying silence. They were massive, clad in white and gray furs, their faces painted with the ash of the northern packs. Kaelen's scouts. The lead scout, a grizzled warrior with a missing ear, stepped forward. He slammed his fist to his chest in a rigid salute. Alpha, you have been gone for 3 suns. We feared the worst. The worst found me, Silas, Kaelen replied, his voice echoing in the stillness. But it did not finish the job. Silas's eyes flicked to Alara. His posture stiffened. The other 2 scouts subtly shifted their weight, their hands drifting toward their axes. They smelled the bitterroot on her. They smelled the Omega status. To them, she was an enemy, or at best a captive. Step away from the bitterroot, trash Alpha. Silas growled, his gaze locking onto Alara like a targeting reticule. We will dispose of her. Kaelen did not raise his voice. He didn't roar. He simply spoke, and the temperature in the gorge seemed to drop another 10 degrees. You will lower your eyes, Silas. The command was absolute. It carried the weight of a king. Silas blinked, confusion warring with instinct, but he immediately dropped his gaze to the snow. This woman, Kaelen said, his words measured and heavy as iron, is Alara. She is the reason I am standing before you. She is not a prisoner. She is not a refugee. She is the new strategic advisor to the Northern Pack. Kaelen turned his head slightly, ensuring every scout heard him clearly. Her word regarding the terrain is my word. You will treat her with the exact level of respect you offer me. Am I understood? The silence that followed was thick. A paradigm had just been shattered. But in the north, loyalty to the Alpha was absolute. Silas placed his fist against his chest again, bowing deeply toward Ilara. Understood, Alpha. Forgive my blindness, advisor. Ilara stared at the scarred warrior. For 21 years, she had been spat on, kicked, and told to look at the dirt. Now a veteran killer was bowing to her. She looked at Kaelen. His golden eyes met hers, steady and reassuring. He had promised her an equal voice. He had just delivered it. Let's go home, Kaelen commanded. The northern stronghold was not a village of tents. It was a fortress. Built directly into the side of a towering sheer cliff face, it was constructed from massive blocks of dark granite and ancient ironwood. Thick smoke plumed from dozens of stone chimneys, promising incredible heat. As they walked through the heavy iron gates, Ilara observed the northern pack. There was no cowering. There were no omegas shivering in the corners. The men and women moved with purpose, maintaining weapons, tending to massive fire pits, and training in the courtyards. It was a society built on discipline and mutual survival, not tyranny. Kaelen led her straight to the central keep. He summoned the pack's healer, a stern older woman named Mara. Patch her up, Kaelen ordered. Give her whatever she needs. For the first time in her life, Ilara was placed on a clean bed. Mara examined the crude stitching on Ilara's ribs, clicking her tongue in professional approval. She cleaned the wound properly, applying a soothing salve of pine resin and calendula that instantly killed the lingering pain. You have hard bones, girl, Mara muttered, wrapping clean linen around Ilara's chest, and a harder spirit. The Alpha does not bring strangers here. Ever. I'm not planning on being a stranger, Ilara said quietly. She rested for exactly 4 hours. When she woke, a set of clothes lay at the foot of the bed. Not ragged hand-me-downs, but perfectly fitted survival gear. Heavy canvas trousers lined with fleece, a boiled leather tunic, and a thick silver-tipped wolf fur cloak. She dressed quickly. She didn't have time to sleep. Thorn was still breathing. A guard escorted her to the war room. It was a massive circular chamber deep inside the cliff. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast a whole elk. In the center of the room stood a massive oak table covered in crude maps, charcoal sticks, and carved wooden markers. Kaelen stood over the table, his broad shoulders tense. Silas and 2 other lieutenants flanked him. They looked up as Ilara entered. Kaelen stepped back from the table and gesturing to the spread of parchment. The floor is yours, advisor. Ilara walked to the table. She looked at the maps. They were inaccurate. They showed the major rivers and the obvious peaks, but they missed the veins of the mountain. They missed the truth. She picked up a stick of thick black charcoal. Your maps are blind, Ilara said flatly. Silas bristled, but Kaelen held up hands, silencing him. Show us. Ilara leaned over the table. Her hand moved with lightning speed, her spatial memory flawless. She drew bold black lines across the parchment. Thorn's strength isn't just in his numbers. Ilara began, her voice gaining confidence with every stroke of the charcoal. He rules through engineered starvation. You think the elk herds migrated east this year because of the hard freeze? They didn't. She slammed the charcoal down on a specific canyon marked on the map. This is the Blackwood Narrows, she said. It's the natural funnel for the winter migration. Thorn's enforcers dammed the upper creek back in October. The water froze solid, creating an ice wall 30 feet high. The herds can't pass. They are forced south directly into Thorn's primary hunting grounds. He is hoarding the meat. The smaller packs on the fringes are starving, forcing them to pledge loyalty to him just to survive. The lieutenant stared at the map in stunned silence. This wasn't just brutality. This was high-level economic warfare. Ilara didn't stop. She drew a series of small circles along the western ridge. And here, the geothermal vents. You think they dried up? They didn't. Thorn had his workers collapse the tunnel entrances with black powder. He sealed the heat beneath the earth so that the outlier territories would freeze. He controls the food. He controls the warmth. He controls the bitterroot. Kaelen stared at the map. The scattered pieces of Thorn's tyranny suddenly formed a terrifying, cohesive picture. He looked at Ilara, his eyes burning with a fierce, absolute respect. He holds the throat of the mountain, Kaelen said softly. Then we cut his hand off, Ilara replied, meeting his gaze. We don't fight his army head-on. We dismantle his infrastructure. We blow the ice dam at Blackwood. We reopen the vents. We give the mountain back to the wolves. Kaelen slammed his fist onto the table. The wood shuddered. Silas, Kaelen barked. Rouse the vanguard, pack mining charges and heavy ropes. We march at dawn. The second week forged them in ice and adrenaline. Ilara did not stay in the stronghold. She rode out with Kaelen and the vanguard. She was their compass. She navigated them through treacherous, invisible passes, bypassing Thorn's watchtowers entirely. They struck with surgical precision. They hit the ice dam at Blackwood under the cover of a whiteout, planting charges and shattering the frozen wall. Within hours, the trapped elk herds flooded back into the neutral territories. They cleared the collapsed stone from 3 major geothermal vents, sending plumes of life-saving heat back into the frozen valleys. Thorn's empire was bleeding, and he didn't even know where the blade was coming from. But a wounded predator is a desperate predator. On the 12th day, Alara and Kaelen were scouting a ridge above a frozen riverbed. The sky was an odd, bruised gray. The air felt heavy, pressing down on the eardrums with a sickening pressure. Below them, a patrol of Thorn's enforcers, 20 heavily armed men, was marching through the gorge. They were tracking the Vanguard's sabotage team. "They are too close to the extraction point," Kaelen muttered, pulling his spyglass from his eye. "If they clear that bend, they'll see Silas and the demolition crew." Kaelen drew his massive broadsword. The steel sang a deadly note in the quiet air. "I will draw them off. Buy Silas the time he needs." "There are 20 of them, Kaelen," Alara said, her eyes fixed on the sky. "I only need to hold them for 10 minutes. He turned to her. "Stay on the ridge. That is an order." Before she could argue, Kaelen launched himself down the steep incline. He hit the riverbed like a mortar shell, snow and ice exploding around him. He didn't hide. He let out a roar that echoed off the canyon walls, a pure, terrifying challenge of an AlphaKing. Thorn's men stopped. They turned. When they saw him, the man they thought was dead standing alone on the ice, they charged. Kaelen met them with the fury of a hurricane. His broadsword shattered weapons and bone. He moved with a brutal, terrifying grace, an apex predator in his element. He dropped the first 3 men in seconds, their blood staining the frozen river. But numbers have a weight of their own. They began to circle him, tightening the noose, using heavy spears to keep his devastating blade at bay. Up on the ridge, Alara did not panic. Panic was a luxury for victims. She was an advisor. She looked at the sky. The altocumulus clouds were stacking rapidly, forming a dense, rippled pattern like fish scales. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the north, suddenly died. Complete, absolute stillness. The hairs on her arms stood up, a massive barometric drop. She looked at the canyon walls. They were sheer, packed with millions of tons of unstable, wind-loaded snow. It had been building for weeks. It was a hair trigger waiting to be pulled. Alara scrambled to the very edge of the cliff. She cupped her hands around her mouth. She didn't scream a warning. She screamed a command. "Kaelen, fall back to the overhang now." Her voice cut through the clash of steel. Down on the ice, Kaelen heard her. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look up to assess the situation. She gave the command and he executed it. With a sweeping, devastating arc of his sword, he forced the enforcers back a few paces. Then he turned and sprinted toward the western wall of the canyon, diving beneath a deep, recessed overhang of solid granite. Thorn's men roared in triumph, thinking the AlphaKing was fleeing. They surged forward, right into the dead center of the gorge. Alara pulled a small, tightly packed explosive charge from her belt, a leftover from the dam sabotage. She struck the fuse. It sparked and hissed. She threw it not at the men below, but straight across the gorge, aiming for the massive snow cornice clinging to the opposite peak. The charge hit the rock face. A split second later, a sharp concussive crack echoed through the canyon. It wasn't a large explosion. It didn't need to be. It was the acoustic trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the mountain groaned. It was a deep structural sound like the breaking of the world's spine. Above the enforcers, the entire eastern face of the canyon detached. Thorn's men looked up. The triumph on their faces melted into absolute paralyzing horror. A white tidal wave, 1,000,000 tons of crushed ice and snow cascaded down the sheer drop. It hit the riverbed with the force of a freight train. The sound was deafening, a physical pressure that punched the air from Alara's lungs even high up on the ridge. The avalanche swallowed the gorge in seconds. The 20 men were erased from existence, buried beneath 50 feet of concrete hard snow. A massive cloud of white powder bloomed into the sky, obscuring everything. Alara held her breath, her hands gripping the rock ledge. The silence returned, thicker and heavier than before. Slowly the powder settled. The gorge was gone, replaced by a smooth, featureless river of white. From beneath the western overhang, a figure emerged, shaking the snow from his heavy furs. Kaelen. He stood amidst the terrifying aftermath of the mountain's wrath, perfectly unharmed. He looked up at the ridge. He found Alara. He didn't cheer. He didn't raise his sword. He simply placed a fist over his heart, a profound, silent acknowledgement of the woman who had just wielded the mountain itself as a weapon. That night, the war room was quiet. The Vanguard was resting. The adrenaline of the past 2 weeks was finally ebbing, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing warm golden light across the stone floor. Kaelen sat on a heavy wooden bench, a whetstone in his hand, methodically running it along the edge of his broadsword. The rhythmic shh sound was meditative. Alara sat nearby, leaning against the warm stone of the hearth. She was exhausted, but her mind was racing. They were winning the skirmishes, but the war was far from over. Kaelen set the sword down. He looked at her. In the firelight, the hard edges of the AlphaKing softened. He looked tired. He looked human. "You did not blink today," Kaelen said quietly. "When you pulled that trigger, you did not hesitate." "Hesitation kills," Alara replied, staring into the flames. "Thorn taught me that. When you are the prey, you learn the hunter's mind. Those men would have put your head on a pike and paraded it through my old camp." Kaelen shifted, leaning closer. "You are not prey, Alara. Not anymore. I have fought alongside veteran warlords who do not possess half your strategic vision. You saved my life in that cave. You saved my life again today in the gorge." He unclasped his heavy fur cloak, letting it drop to the bench. He wore only a thin linen shirt beneath it. For the first time, Alara truly saw the scars. His arms, his chest, his neck, they were a tapestry of violence. But the worst was a massive, jagged burn mark that covered his left shoulder, wrapping around his collarbone. Kaelen saw her looking. He didn't cover it up. "Silver fire," Kaelen said, his voice flat. "10 years ago, I was betrayed by the men I trusted most. A council of alphas who believed I was too soft because I refused to enslave the weaker packs. They invited me to a parley under a flag of truce. They locked the doors and set the hall ablaze with silver-laced pitch. I was the only one who broke out." Alara's breath hitched. She knew the pain of silver. To be burned alive in it was unimaginable. "That is why I fight Thorn," Kaelen continued, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "Not for territory, not for pride, but because a system built on the blood of the innocent is a system that deserves to be burned to the ground. I swore I would never let an alpha rule through terror again." Alara slowly reached up. She unlaced the collar of her tunic, pulling the fabric aside just enough to reveal the brutal, jagged scar that slashed across her collarbone and down toward her heart. Thorn's parting gift. "I was told I was a stain." Alara whispered, the vulnerability foreign and terrifying on her tongue. "I was told my blood was poison. For 20 years I believed them. I let them make me small." Kaelen stood up. He walked over to her. He didn't tower over her. He knelt on one knee in front of the hearth, bringing himself down to her eye level. The heat of the fire was nothing compared to the heat radiating from his massive frame. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering inches from her scar. He did not touch her. He waited. Alara looked into his eyes. There was no pity. There was no demand. There was only a fierce, overwhelming reverence. Slowly, Alara nodded. Kaelen's fingers, warm and incredibly gentle, brushed against the raised skin of her scar. A shiver ran down her spine, not from fear, but from the electric shock of being truly seen, of being touched with respect. "They were fools," Kaelen murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that settled deep in her chest. "They looked at a diamond and called it glass. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Alara of the Bitterroot." The distance between them was practically non-existent. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of the weeks they had spent bleeding and fighting together. This wasn't a sudden spark. This was a fire that had been carefully built log by log, forged in mutual respect and shared survival. Alara didn't wait for him. She didn't want to be passive. She was a partner. She reached up, her hands tangling in the thick hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him forward. The kiss was not frantic. It was deliberate. It was heavy with promise and absolute commitment. Kaelen's hands moved to her waist, anchoring her to him, his mouth claiming hers with a desperate, crushing tenderness. It felt like coming home after a lifetime in the cold. It felt like an oath being sworn in blood and breath. When they finally pulled apart, the silence in the room was entirely different. It was the silence of a fortified wall. Kaelen rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "I will tear Thorn apart with my bare hands for what he did to you." Alara shook her head. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. Her mind was already shifting back to the map, back to the endgame. "No," Alara said, her voice hard as diamond. "If you kill him in single combat, you become a martyr or a conqueror. The other packs will just fight for his throne. The cycle will continue. We have to destroy him legally. We have to destroy the foundation of his power." Kaelen frowned. "How he controls the regional council?" "He doesn't control the Grand Alliance," Alara said, the pieces clicking into place in her brilliant mind. "The Supreme Council of the North American Pacts. If we bring them undeniable proof of his crimes, proof that he blocked the vents, that he altered the migration, that he murdered my mother to steal the geography, they will strip him of his alpha status. He will be exiled, humiliated, systemically dismantled. We have the proof of the vents and the dam, Kaelen said. But your mother, it is your word against his. Not just my word, Alara said, her eyes flashing in the firelight. Before he killed her, my mother hid the treaty relic, the original engraved stone of the Bitterroot Pact. It outlines the sacred laws of the thermal vents. Thorn has been searching for it for a decade to destroy it, because if it is brought before the Alliance, it proves he committed high treason against the pact laws. Kaelen sat back, realizing the magnitude of what she was saying. Where is it? Alara looked toward the dark window toward the Bitterroot Mountains. It's in the one place Thorn never looks, she said softly. It's buried beneath the floorboards of the Omega Barracks, inside his own compound. We have to go back. We have to walk right into the mouth of the beast. The infiltration of the Bitterroot compound was not an act of war. It was an act of ghosts. They moved under the cover of a moonless night, the sky choked with heavy black clouds. Kaelen brought only 3 men leaving the vanguard hidden in the eastern ridgeline. This was not a siege. This was a surgical extraction. Alara led them. She knew the blind spots in Thorn's patrols. She knew the exact rotation of the guards, the heavy, arrogant rhythm of men who believed their fortress was impenetrable. They bypassed the main gates entirely, scaling the sheer ice-slicked western wall, where the wind howled too loudly for any sentry to hear the scrape of grappling hooks. When they dropped into the compound, Alara felt the immediate suffocating weight of her past. The smell of the wood smoke, the layout of the slaughter sheds, the distant muffled coughing from the Omega Barracks. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a primal instinct screaming at her to run. But Kaelen was a solid, silent presence at her shoulder. He did not push her. He simply anchored her to the present. 3 minutes, Kaelen whispered, his breath pluming in the freezing dark. Alara nodded. She slipped across the frozen mud of the courtyard, moving like a shadow detached from the wall. She reached the Omega Barracks, a dilapidated, drafty longhouse barely fit for livestock. She didn't go through the main door. She went to the crawl space beneath the northern foundation, a gap she had dug out with her bare hands over the course of 5 grueling winters. She slid into the freezing darkness beneath the floorboards. The earth smelled of rot and forgotten things. She counted the heavy timber joists in the pitch black, 4 across 6 deep. Her cold fingers found the loose stone. She pried it up, ignoring the sharp pain as a nail gouged her knuckle. Beneath the stone, buried in the frozen dirt, was a heavy bundle wrapped in oiled leather. She pulled it free. The weight of it was immense. It wasn't just stone, it was history. The treaty relic. Alara scrambled back out into the biting wind. Kaelen was waiting. He saw the bundle in her arms, in the fierce, uncompromising light in her eyes. He didn't say a word. He simply signaled the men, and they vanished back over the wall, leaving Thorn's empire entirely untouched, yet utterly destroyed. They did not ride back to the northern stronghold. They rode higher, to summon the Grand Alliance, the supreme governing body of all North American wolf packs. One did not send a messenger. One lit the sky beacon. It sat at the summit of Mount Sentinel, a peak so high the air thinned to a razor's edge. The climb took 12 brutal hours. The horses could not make it. They climbed on foot, fighting through waist-deep drifts and navigating treacherous icefalls. When they reached the summit, the sky was beginning to bleed into a pale, bruised dawn. The beacon was a massive iron crucible, 20 feet across, filled with ancient petrified pitch and cedar logs. It had not been lit in a century. It was reserved only for matters of treason, for threats to the very existence of the species. Kaelen stood before the crucible. He struck a heavy flint against his steel dagger. Sparks showered onto a bundle of dry tinder. He blew on it until a small, bright flame caught. He did not light the beacon. He turned and offered the burning tinder to Alara. "This is not my vengeance," Kaelen said, his voice carrying over the whistling wind. "This is your justice. You light the fire." Onto Alara took the flame. She looked down at the vast, frozen expanse of the Bitterroot Mountains. For 21 years, she had been a victim of this landscape. Today, she became its architect. She tossed the flame into the crucible. The ancient pitch caught instantly. With a sound like a jet engine, a massive pillar of blinding orange fire erupted into the sky. It roared upward, a beacon of absolute authority that would be seen for hundreds of miles. From the Canadian border down to the valleys of Idaho, every alpha, every beta, every elder would see the fire. The summons was absolute. By the old laws, they had 3 days to assemble at the Valley of the Ancients. The Valley of the Ancients was neutral ground, a massive flat caldera formed by a dormant volcano ringed by sheer cliffs of black basalt. By the dawn of the third day, the valley was filled. Over 500 wolves representing 12 different packs across the Pacific Northwest stood in disciplined, silent ranks. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the scent of ozone and impending violence. At the northern end of the caldera sat the Grand Alliance, 7 elders. They were old men and women, their faces deeply lined, their bodies carrying the scars of 100 wars. They did not wear crowns. They wore the pelts of apex predators, their authority derived not from wealth but from centuries of accumulated wisdom and survival. Thorn arrived with an escort of 50 heavily armed enforcers. He wore his silver wolf pelt, his chest puffed out with arrogant indignation. He believed this assembly was about the sabotage of his dam and his vents. He believed he was the victim, ready to demand Kaelen's head for violating territorial borders. Kaelen arrived with only 10 men, and Alara. She did not walk behind him. She walked beside him. She wore the heavy canvas and leather of the north. Her auburn hair pulled back, the white streak at her temples stark and visible. The massive oiled leather bundle was strapped across her back. Thorn's eyes locked onto her. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face instantly, replaced by a sneer of absolute disgust. He stepped forward into the center of the caldera, addressing the elders. "Honored Alliance," Thorn's voice boomed, dripping with false respect. "I answer the beacon, but I demand to know why the Alpha of the North is allowed to stand here after launching unprovoked terrorist attacks on my infrastructure. He blew the Blackwood Dam. He collapsed the Eastern Ridge, and he stands before you with a traitorous Omega from my own camp." The lead elder, a massive man with completely white eyes, leaned forward. His voice was a rasping whisper that somehow commanded the entire valley. "Kaelen of the North, you lit the fire. Do you answer these charges?" Kaelen stepped forward. He did not draw his sword. He did not raise his voice. He exuded the calm, terrifying stillness of a man holding a winning hand. "I lit the fire, Elder," Kaelen said smoothly, "but I am not the prosecutor today. I am merely the shield." Kaelen stepped back, physically yielding the floor. He gestured to Alara. A ripple of shock went through the assembled packs. An Alpha yielding the floor to an Omega at a Grand Alliance tribunal was unprecedented. It bordered on blasphemy. Thorn let out a bark of incredulous laughter. "You bring a dog to speak in a council of wolves. This is a mockery of our laws." "The only mockery of our laws," Alara said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a rifle shot, "is the man wearing the silver pelt of the Bitterroot." She did not wait for permission. She unslung the heavy leather bundle from her back and walked to the massive flat stone altar in the center of the caldera. She dropped the bundle. The heavy thud echoed off the basalt cliffs. She untied the leather, revealing the treaty relic, the ancient stone slab deeply engraved with the runes of the first packs. The elders shifted in their seats. They recognized it instantly. 20 years ago, Ilara spoke, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the valley carrying to every listening ear. "My mother, the keeper of the geothermal maps, was executed by Alpha Thorn. He claimed she was a traitor selling secrets to the south. He lied." Alara pulled a series of parchment maps from her coat, the ones she had drawn in Kaelen's war room. She spread them out over the altar, pinning them down with daggers. "My mother was killed because she refused to hand over the coordinates of the deep winter vents." Alara continued, her words precise, systematic, and entirely devoid of hysteria. She was delivering a lethal dose of facts. Thorn did not want to protect the vents. He wanted to bury them. She pointed to the maps. He collapsed the eastern vents. He dammed the Blackwood Narrows. He intentionally altered the elk migration and suffocated the ambient heat of the valley. He manufactured a famine. He hoarded the only remaining food and warmth, forcing the smaller outlier packs to sign away their hunting rights and their sovereignty just to keep their pups from freezing. Angry murmurs began to ripple through the ranks of the outlier packs. Men and women who had watched their families starve while Thorn grew fat on their desperation. "This is treason against the species," Alara declared, staring directly at the elders. "Article 4 of the treaty relic states clearly, the heat of the earth belongs to the pack, not to the crown. To sever the mountain's blood is to sever one's own right to rule." Thorn's face was purple with rage. "Lies, the ravings of a broken Omega trying to take down her betters. Where is your proof, girl? A few charcoal drawings. You have nothing." Thorn turned to his beta, a tall, severe woman named Isolde. Isolde had been Thorn's enforcer for 15 years. She was ruthless, brilliant, and intimately involved in the logistics of the Bitterroot pack. "Isolde," Thorn barked, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. Tell them, tell this council that the vents collapse naturally. Tell them this Omega is a liar who deserves to be executed on this very stone. The valley held its breath. The entire case hung on this moment. Kaelen tensed his hand, dropping to the pommel of his broadsword, ready to defend Alara if the council ruled against her. Isolde stepped out from the ranks of the Bitterroot enforcers. She walked slowly toward the center altar. She looked at the treaty relic. She looked at the intricate, devastatingly accurate maps Alara had drawn. She saw the locations of the hidden meat caches, the supply lines of the hoarded resources. Then Isolde looked at Alara. She saw the white streak in her hair. She saw the Omega who had survived the blizzard, survived the wolves, and returned to dismantle a tyrant. Isolde did not draw her weapon. She reached into her heavy fur coat. She pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. She dropped it onto the altar next to Alara's maps. The structural integrity of the eastern vents was compromised by black powder, requisitioned on the 4th of October 10 years ago, Isolde said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the voice of a quartermaster reading an inventory of death. The Blackwood Dam was constructed by Bitterroot engineers under direct orders from Alpha Thorn. The ledgers detail the exact tonnage of elk meat withheld from the southern packs during the freezes of the last 5 winters. Thorn stumbled back as if he had been physically struck. Isolde, you betray me. Isolde finally looked at him. There was no warmth in her eyes, only the cold, hard logic of survival. I serve the Bitterroot pack, Thorn. You are starving the pack to feed your own ego. You are bad for logistics, and you are in violation of the ancient laws. Pandemonium erupted in the valley. The outlier pack surged forward at furious, demanding blood. The Bitterroot enforcers, seeing their beta turn and the undeniable proof on the table, lowered their weapons, refusing to defend a man who had engineered their own misery. Silence! The lead elder's voice cracked like thunder. The valley instantly went still. The elder stood up. He walked down from the basalt throne, approaching the altar. He picked up Isolde's ledger. He looked at Alara's maps. He placed his ancient, scarred hand on the treaty relic. He turned to Thorn. You did not lead your people, Thorn, the elder pronounced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. You held them hostage. You used the mountain as a weapon against your own kind. You have broken the sacred covenant. Thorn bared his teeth, dropping into a half-crouch, his muscles coiling. I am the Alpha. You cannot take my lands. You have no lands, the elder said. By the power of the Grand Alliance, you are stripped of your title. You are stripped of your pack. Your wealth, your stockpiles, and your territory are hereby seized and will be redistributed to the outlier packs you sought to destroy. Thorn roared, a sound of pure feral desperation. He lunged not at the elder, but at Alara. He wanted to take the architect of his destruction down with him. He never made it. Kaelen moved faster than the eye could track. He intercepted Thorn mid-leap, his massive shoulder slamming into Thorn's chest. The impact shattered ribs. Kaelen drove him into the frozen earth, pinning him down with a heavy boot to his throat. Kaelen drew his broadsword. The steel rested a fraction of an inch from Thorn's jugular. I could kill you right now, Kaelen whispered, the AlphaKing's aura pressing down on Thorn with crushing weight. It would be easy. It would be satisfying. But Alara was right. Death is too quick for a man like you. You do not get to die a warrior. Kaelen stepped back, sheathing his sword. The elder Alpha stepped forward. Thorn, you are sentenced to the true exile. You will be escorted to the barren ice fields of the far north. You will go without weapons. You will go without furs. You will live the rest of your miserable days knowing exactly what it feels like to freeze in the dark, just as you forced so many others to do. 4 massive enforcers from the Alliance stepped forward. They hauled Thorn to his feet. They stripped him of his silver wolf pelt. They took his knives. They dragged him away, a broken, shivering man screaming curses into the wind that no one cared to hear. The trial was over. The tyrant had fallen not by the sword, but by the undeniable crushing weight of truth and systemic justice. The elder turned to Alara. He bowed his head slightly, an elder bowing to an Omega. The mountain remembers Alara of the Bitterroot, the elder said. Your mother's honor is restored, and your pack is in need of a leader. Alara looked at the faces of the Bitterroot wolves, the people who had tormented her, who had ignored her pain. They were looking at her now, not with hatred, but with a desperate, tentative hope. Alara looked at Kaelen. He smiled, a quiet, proud expression that warmed her down to her soul. He had kept his promise. He had been her sword, but she had swung the blade. I will not be their Alpha, Alara said to the elder, her voice carrying across the silent caldera. The time of solitary rulers hoarding power in the mountains is over. She turned to face the hundreds of assembled wolves. We will form a council, Elara declared, her vision of the future crystal clear. Representatives from every pack, every prey, every ridge, and every valley. The maps of the thermal vents will be public knowledge. The food caches will be shared. And the term Omega is hereby abolished from the Bitterroot. From this day forward, a wolf's worth is measured by their contribution to the whole, not the rank of their birth. A cheer went up. It started small from the ragged outlier packs, and then it spread, growing into a deafening roar that shook the snow from the high peaks. It was the sound of a system breaking and a new world being born. But the Bitterroot Mountains had learned to breathe again, and peace in the wild is never a permanent condition. It is a garden that must be violently defended. 14 months had passed since Thorn was stripped of his pelt and cast into the blinding white of the true exile. The Council of Ridges, the new democratic body Elara had established, was functioning. The thermal vents were open, the meat caches were full, and the term Omega had been struck from the pack's vocabulary. It was an era of unprecedented prosperity. But prosperity breeds a very specific kind of resentment among men who used to rule by fear. It started quietly. A missing supply sled on the Western Pass, a collapsed bridge over the Whitewater Gorge. At first, the council attributed it to the harshness of the mountain spring. But Elara knew the mountain better than anyone. The mountain was indifferent. It did not cut support ropes with serrated blades. She stood in the center of the newly expanded war room, the massive oak table covered in updated, highly detailed topographical maps. The white streak at her temple had grown more pronounced over the past year, a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. Kaelen stood beside her, his massive frame wrapped in a simple boiled leather tunic. The AlphaKing title was gone, replaced by Commander of the Vanguard, a title he wore with far more pride. 3 incidents in 10 days, Elara said, her finger tracing a deliberate, jagged line across the parchment. They are hitting the exact routes we used to transport the sulfur from the lower vents. Only a Bitterroot enforcer knows these paths. Kaelen's jaw tightened. Vane. Vane had been Thorn's most brutal lieutenant. He had slipped away during the Grand Alliance Tribunal, vanishing into the deep timber with a handful of hardline loyalists. He wants to break the supply chain, Kaelen rumbled. He wants the outlier packs to freeze this winter so they lose faith in the council. Then we prove him wrong, Elara said, her eyes flashing with a cold, brilliant tactical light. We know his objective now. The main sulfur convoy moves through the jagged pass of Dead Man's Drop tomorrow night. We don't reroute. We let him hit it. But we send the vanguard. We bleed this infection out of the mountain once and for all. The night was pitch black at Dead Man's Drop. High above the ravine, clinging to the freezing slate, Vane watched the convoy of sleds below. He raised his hand, signaling the 20 armed loyalists hidden in the rocks around him. But before a single bowstring could snap, the darkness above them exploded. Kaelen dropped from the upper canopy like a falling star, landing directly in the center of Vane's squad. Simultaneously, the drivers of the sleds down in the ravine threw off their heavy furs. It wasn't a supply run, it was Silas and the heaviest shock troops of the vanguard immediately laying down a suppressing fire. It was a perfectly executed trap. Elara had mapped the ambush flawlessly. Vane snarled, lunging at Kaelen with 2 serrated hatchets. The clash was brutal but brief. Kaelen sidestepped a blow and brought the pommel of his sword down in a crushing strike, shattering Vane's collarbone and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The fight around them was already over. The vanguard had disarmed the remaining loyalists. Vane spat a mouthful of blood. Do it then! Kill me! Show them that the Alpha still rules by the blade. He wanted to be a martyr. Kaelen stood over him, the bloody tip of his broadsword resting an inch from Vane's throat. From the shadows, Elara emerged. Put the sword away, Commander, she said quietly. Kaelen didn't hesitate. He sheathed the massive blade. The clack of the metal sounded like a gavel falling. I have the stomach to watch you rot in a cell, Elara told the furious enforcer. If we kill you here in the dark, we are no better than Thorn. You will stand trial in the sunlight before the very people you tried to starve. You will be judged as a criminal. Vane's bravado shattered. Silas's heavy iron shackles clamped down on his wrists, ending the rebellion not with a dramatic execution, but with the cold, undeniable grip of the law. Kaelen reached out his large hand, wrapping around Elara's. You denied him his martyrdom. A society is not built on the blood of its enemies, Kaelen, Elara said, looking up at the stars. It is built on the strength of its laws. 20 years later, time in the Bitterroot is measured by the winter survived. The war room had been moved to a massive open-air timber lodge built over the central hot springs. The Council of Ridges was in session. The circular table was surrounded by 30 representatives, alphas, betas, and former omegas arguing passionately over trade routes and lumber quotas. It was loud, it was messy, it was glorious. Standing on the elevated balcony overlooking the chamber were two figures. Kaelen's hair was now a distinguished silver. His back remained perfectly straight, a living legend who had laid down his crown to build a republic. Beside him stood Alara. Her hair was a beautiful crown of silver gray. She held a wooden staff pointing at the massive public maps she still maintained. They watched a young woman, a representative from the southern ridges, passionately arguing for a new bridge construction. Kaelen smiled, pulling Alara close against his side. She fights like you did. Relentless. She has better maps than I did, Alara said softly, and she doesn't have to fight for her right to speak. She just has to fight for the bridge. You gave them that, Kaelen said, kissing the crown of her head. You walked into a blizzard with nothing but a ragged coat, and you gave them the world. Alara looked out the massive glass windows toward the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. The wild would never be tamed, but they had carved a sanctuary out of the ice. The young believe that history is made in moments of explosive violence. But when the smoke clears, you realize the truth. History is made in the quiet, stubborn moments. It is made by those who choose to draw a new map when the old one leads only to suffering. We did not just defeat a tyrant in these mountains, we defeated the idea of tyranny. We built a home that will outlast our names, our scars, and our memories. The fire is lit, and it will never go out. Fade to black.